All right. Hey, everybody. So, usually I like to make my videos as visually appealing as possible, but right now it's close to 100 degrees outside. So, you are getting this from my in law's bedroom while I hunt for an apartment in the new place that we're living. So, wanted to jump in and answer some more of your questions because just have a ton of great ones. So, let's get started. So, this one is asked by Trent. In various places, Rand claims that an immortal robot couldn't properly value because it wouldn't face the fundamental life and death alternative faced by finite mortal organisms. Since she clearly wants to draw the strongest possible logical connection between the contingent nature of life and the act of valuing. I've never been able to accept this connection as she stated and defended it. It's not clear to me that I would be incapable of valuing, of finding things to gain and keep if I were suddenly to become immortal and destructible. Would the taste of my favorite food, my joy in talking to friends, my curiosity suddenly lose meaning if they were no longer necessary to keep me alive? And he goes on, but basically saying this just doesn't seem right. And let me start by saying I actually don't find the analogy helpful for some of the reasons mentioned, but I do want to defend it because it's actually right and making a really important point. And notice that Rand didn't say, like, imagine a mortal person, because the fact that we're living organisms who can die, it gives rise to pleasure, pain, it gives rise to emotions, which are the forms that we experience the alternative of life or death. And so if you're trying to isolate the role of the alternative of life or death, you can't keep features of organisms that exist as signals of life or death. But let's say you did that. Let's say you made a human being immortal. I don't think it's obvious what the implications of that are. Like, oh, did you see the movie Groundhog Day, for example? You essentially have an immortal person. He goes through this period of wanting to commit suicide. And there's something really right about that, because if you're truly immortal, you would experience pleasure or pain, and like you would probably want to avoid fire or whatever. But would you actually have a reason to go on living? Would you have a reason to do anything? And certainly not anything that required effort over time, and certainly not like a reason to exert effort now as opposed to in 100 billion or 100 trillion years from now. Like, why would you? Because you feel a certain way. And it's not even obvious like how you would feel, because our whole conception of progress, achievement, of valuing, that comes in the context of a finite conditional life. And I don't think you can jump to the assumption that, like, oh, it would be basically the same, only I wouldn't die. I think we have no clue, like, psychologically what the impact of that would be. And let's say even if you did set a goal because you thought like it would lead to more pleasure, and that seemed all right, well, that's better than pain. The key point is that you'd have no grounds for saying it was better or worse than any other goal. You'd have no grounds for saying like you should pursue it, or that somebody else shouldn't pursue a completely different goal. Like, even if it was pleasurable, so what? Nothing hinges on that pleasure. There's nothing at stake for you in achieving pleasure, because nothing's at stake for you ever. And that's Rand's whole point, that to be able to discriminate good or bad, better or worse, in order to have evaluative concepts, not just different, then you have to have something at stake. And without the alternative of existence or non-existence, nothing is at stake. So here's two questions about taxes from two different people, but I figure I'll answer them at once since they're basically the same. Is there a correct response to this? Also, principles do matter. Hence, a principle of our society is that there is a system of progressive income tax levied on all those who earn income in order to pay for facilities and services for all. Here's the next question. What's your counter argument to people who say taxes for things like schools, roads, healthcare, etc. are the price we pay to live in a free society, and that if you don't like it, you can go live on a desert island? I normally state that you don't lose rights by joining society. And the starting point for this, I think, is that taxation is a derivative issue. And the fundamental issue, the question is really like, what is the purpose of government? What role should it fulfill? And usually what's happening with these sorts of objections is somebody doesn't agree with you about the purpose of government. It's not really a debate about taxes. Like, it's a debate about the things that we use taxes to fund. And so if someone raises this kind of question, my answer is usually going to be, so are you saying that you agree with me that government should only protect our rights, but you happen to think that like government has to be funded by coercive taxation? And in most cases, the answer is no, right? Like, of course not. I think the government should do all sorts of things. I think it should provide Social Security. I think that it should regulate healthcare. I think that it should, strip the rich of their income in order to limit inequality. And you can then have the debate at that level and say, is that really a moral purpose of government? But let's say they agree, right? Let's say they say, yeah, I think the government should only protect our rights, but that you need coercive taxation to fund it. And since like we all benefit, it's not an unjust taking. Like, on the contrary, it's unjust for people to get a service they don't pay for. Now, I actually don't think that's a crazy position. Morally, certainly, I do think people have an obligation to pay for a government that's protecting their rights. But in the end, though, I don't think it's a convincing objection or a convincing position, because the whole premise of a rights-protecting government is what you earn is yours. Or that's not the whole premise, but that's a key component of a government that exists to protect your rights. Your wealth doesn't belong to the government, so the government has no right to just decide unilaterally, all right, I say that I'm entitled to 30% of your income and I'm going to seize it against your will. Now, be careful here in trying to draw analogies with a private business or service and to say that, like, well, look, since we have to pay for one, we should have to pay for the other. Because first of all, we don't have to pay for services. Like, you can ask people to give you food or clean your house for free. They're just free to refuse, right? But the government doesn't work that way because it's not a service. It's not, the way anarchists insist, a protection service. It's an agency to extract force from human affairs. You can't say like, oh, I opt out of the government. You can't opt out in the sense that then you're free to violate the rules or, and this is really the key point. You can't opt out in the sense of saying like, I don't want it to enforce its rules when people violate my rights. That's because if somebody violates your rights, they are declaring themselves to be a threat to everyone else. Right? They're showing in action that they choose to live by force rather than by persuasion. And so, punishing the person who violated your rights, the government isn't performing some service for you as an individual. It's acting as an agent for everyone in society. So here's how I think of it. A government isn't something that everybody in society creates through some imaginary social contract. It's something that some number of people establish to fund their rights. But to protect their rights, that government has to protect the rights of everyone in society, including those who don't believe in rights and who refuse to pay. Last word on this is I'm not worried about the ability of a proper government to raise sufficient funds voluntarily. Like, you couldn't have such a government absent a high proportion of people with a sense of personal responsibility. And I mean, frankly, the majority of the money is going to come from the wealthiest individuals who have the most to lose and who can most afford to pay. In fact, I think you would arguably have more progressive taxation in a voluntary situation than you do today. Would there be free riders? Yeah, but so what? The free riders are not a problem, particularly if you reject this, economic way of thinking about human motivation where, 99% of people are not going to pay because they can, quote, get away with it. Most people want to pay for what they get. And so I just don't see it as an issue. All right, next question. This comes from Nelson. How can an intellectual fighter best manage their time with other values in life? Professional, career, relationships, hobbies, leisure, art, pets, etc. I suppose I'm in the hunt for intellectual fighter time management hacks. Haha. So, I can give you the basic answer, which is basically you define your hierarchy of values and you act accordingly. Your hierarchy of values is essentially a time hierarchy of what deserves most time. But if you're really asking about time management in the sense of optimizing how you spend your time, I am frankly the last person to ask, because the truth is I don't try to optimize my time. So, it's always dangerous to divide the world into two categories, but like I think some people are kind of systematizers and optimizers. And if you're one of those people, like I highly recommend listening to Alex Epstein's Human Flourishing Project. And I love listening to optimizers because, it gives me a bunch of ideas and things I like to try. But at a certain point, I realize like that is not how I am, and that's not how I want to be. Like to me, it completely sounds miserable to be trying to eke like every last, ounce of efficiency out of your life. And I know it's not experienced that way by optimizers, but it definitely is for me. And so if you want me to put it as provocatively as possible, my approach to life is to maximize whim worship. All right. So I'm mostly joking about that, but I'm kind of not joking. Like I try to be extremely rational at the level of values and virtues and ideas. But when it comes to like how I spend my day, my ideal that I'm striving for is really to do like whatever I want to do in the moment. So I think of three considerations when I approach my day. One is things I have to do. Two is things I want to do. And three is things I have the energy to do. So my approach to life really consists of trying to get rid of as many things as I have to do as possible, either by, cutting them out of life or by delegating them. And if I can't get rid of them, then like I either try to get them out of the way as quickly as possible or I procrastinate as long as possible. And like if you asked me, well, what's your system for deciding when to do which? It's basically whatever approach seems to help me spend the most time doing the things I want to do. And that really leads me to energy, which is like central to the extent that I'm like planning out my days or structuring my days. This is really the key to how I think about it. So first of all, I wake up between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m. and my first 2 to 4 hours are really my peak creative hours. And by 2 p.m., I'm totally spent in terms of creativity and willpower. And so what I try to do is I use at least those first 2 hours for my favorite, most enjoyable, most creative projects, which gets me out of bed, gets me excited about the day, and allows me to make progress on the things that matter most to me. And then I have some kind of morning stuff I have to do to take care of the kids and whatever, but, showering and so on. But 9 to 12, this is really where I'm going to do any stuff that I have to do that requires creative mental focus, but which isn't like super pleasurable or just, super engaging. And if I don't have any of that, even better, then I can just keep going on creative, enjoyable tasks. Then from like 12 to 2, and none of this is carved in stone. This is just sort of like rules of thumb that I try to go by. From 12 to 2, hopefully I'm able to like return to some more creative, enjoyable tasks. But by 2, usually I am burnt out regardless of how much fun a creative, effortful task is. And there have been exceptions. I mean, there's been times, particularly when I'm writing like a book or an article, or even better, editing those, when I can go for just like all day until night and it's hard to pull me away. But as a generality, no, by 2, I'm done. And so then what I like to do is use that 2 to 5 period for things that don't require a lot of energy or creativity. So this is like meetings, answering emails, any chores or things I've been procrastinating on and letting pile up. And then in the evenings, it's honestly just a complete crapshoot. Like I'll have family time, or I'll read sometimes, or I'll listen to podcasts or talk to friends. But like I'm honestly totally okay with just wasting time watching YouTube videos. Like, so that's my actual day in most cases. But like really my ideal day would be waking up, working on one long-term creative project that I'm obsessed about until I run out of energy, and then hanging out with friends and family talking about ideas and like having amazing food and drinks, or like going to a baseball game. That is utopia for me. And like when I talk about like I want to be successful, there's many things where I do feel successful already, but that's the real gold mine. Like if I can get where, 75% of my days are one project I'm really excited about, and then friends and family, that's really what life is about. I don't care about money. I don't care about any of that stuff, except like insofar as it aids me getting to that point. But here's the main thing I want to underline. If I make progress on a meaningful, creative, long-term project in those first 2 to 4 hours of the day, then I am happy with the day. And I don't judge myself at all for how I spend the rest of the day. Like, my attitude is I earn the right to do whatever the hell else I want to do, whatever I feel like doing. And if that means watching baseball or frittering away, time on social media, like, that is fine. So if you're an optimizer, like, that's awesome. But what I want to discourage this idea that you have some duty to like make the best use of your time, and you should feel guilty for not being able to impose some rigid structure or schedule on yourself. Like, no, your life really does belong to you. And, Ayn Rand used to quote this idea of God said, take what you want and pay for it. And you can take that too subjectively, but you can take it not subjectively enough, if you want to put it that way. That it really is, what do you want out of life? And then you bear the consequences for that. But you don't have to answer to anyone, including like, this image of yourself as like this ideal, productive person or something like that. And so, I don't worry about optimizing. I worry about enjoying. And part of what I enjoy is just not being too rigid about my approach to the day-to-day. But as you'll see, it's not literally whim worship in the sense of there is a core structure there. There is priorities that I'm setting according to my hierarchy of values. But within there, I'm being very free-form and in the moment. So I think this is going to be the last question. Yeah. This is from Dean. Was it a mistake to use the word selfishness? So this is a super common question, and I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, the word antagonizes people. We're using it in a way that's totally different from how others use it. And I mean, even more than that, right? When we explain how we use it, people are way more open to our ideas. When we say, like, we mean people who are doing what's genuinely good for you without sacrificing yourself to others or others to yourself, most people are like, yeah, that sounds way more reasonable. And so why not just use a different term like rational self-interest or personal happiness or individual flourishing? And in some contexts you should. Like, it's not that you have an obligation to always use the word selfishness. But when you're asking this question, you should think, like, why did Ayn Rand use it? At least she was pretty smart. I mean, it was her theory. She built a huge audience. You're here, right? So what was her reasoning? And it's not hidden, right? Like, the virtue of selfishness begins with an extended discussion of why she's reclaiming the word. And reclaiming words is not some unusual phenomenon. This is a point that Greg Salmieri, the objectivist philosopher, has pointed out that I think is really valuable to perspective to have, that there is this proud tradition of reclaiming words that have built up negative evaluations that you think are not warranted and need to be questioned and challenged. So, for instance, the gay community reclaiming queer and saying, like, you're building in a derogatory judgment of homosexuals and we think that's wrong, so we're claiming it as a positive. That is something that's not unique to Ayn Rand. And so then the only question is, like, well, why does she want to reclaim selfishness? And the key issue here is that the conventional definition of selfishness is not just different from Ayn Rand's. It's not just different, it's illegitimate. So here's what Rand is not doing, right? She's not saying, you think rape is bad, but I think it's good. Only I use it to mean consensual sex with someone you love. Like, that's not at all what she's doing with selfishness. Her view is that the conventional usage of selfishness is a package deal that includes people who sacrifice others to self and people who genuinely independently pursue their own interests without sacrifice, like professional businessmen. both get grouped together because people have been taught that you're either sacrificing yourself to others or you're sacrificing others to yourself. And that since a billionaire like Steve Jobs obviously wasn't sacrificing himself, he was obviously doing what he wanted to do, he was obviously benefiting from his actions, well, then he belongs in the same category as Bernie Madoff. That's in effect what's being expressed and achieved with the conventional concept of selfishness. And Ayn Rand saying, like, no, that's not just a different way of defining the word, that is BS. And so what would happen then in a world where people think that way? If you just said, well, I'm for individual flourishing, right? Not selfishness and not altruism. Well, they point to examples of individual flourishing and say, but that's selfish. To change people's moral thinking, you actually have to tackle this issue of the package deal head on. You have to let people know that, like, your conventional way of thinking about morality is totally wrong. It's so wrong that this word that you throw around, selfish, you don't even know what it means. You can't distinguish between a producer and a criminal. You're horribly, horribly confused. Now you might say, okay, but like, what word are we going to use for someone like Bernie Madoff if we can't call him selfish? And here I want to touch on a deeper point about Rand's view that I don't think people appreciate enough. Selfishness is a moral term. And now, according to altruism, morality is really just a matter of, like, who should benefit from our actions. And as long as you're not the one benefiting, what you're doing is good. And if, according to altruism, you're selfish if you don't do that, if you don't go around benefiting non-you. And so, like, easy, we just divided every action and every person into two moral camps, selfish and selfless. But part of what Rand's pointing out, another thing that Rand points out, is that altruism isn't a complete morality. It has no actual content. It has no definition of what's actually good. It replaces beneficiary with any content. It has no positive conception of the good. The good is simply non-you. And in Rand's view, and in actual fact, most people fall under no moral classification in this way, meaning a moral code, because they aren't actually trying to live by a morality. There's no broad category that includes Bernie Madoff, Osama bin Laden, a guy who cuts you off in traffic, a kid who won't share his toys, etc. Like, there's no broad moral category for that. And if you say, well, okay, but just at the level of motives, aren't at least we could say these people motivated by their own happiness or pleasure? And again, no. Part of Rand's whole perspective is that we're not automatically driven by a positive, that you can't equate what she called motivation by love with motivation by fear. And so when people label these things selfish, it's not really an attempt to identify a genuine motive. It's more like a shortcut. They're basically just saying, I don't know why he did what he did, but it wasn't nice. And so on Rand's view, selfishness is a moral code, and that means it's a conscious, deliberate attempt to achieve your actual interests. And so we have to distinguish it primarily from codes that ask us to consciously and deliberately sacrifice our interests. And then to say you're committed to your own interests means in part that, like, you're actually thinking then, I'm committed to my interests, so what factually is good for me as a human being? And so what I want to underline here is that Rand is making a big ask of people. She's asking them to completely change the way they think about moral issues. She's not just asking them to add a new category, but to completely rethink morality from the ground up. And so given that goal, she needs to, like, grab people and say, like, you have no clue what morality is. You have no clue what selfishness is. You have no clue what altruism is. And if you did, you would abandon altruism and you'd embrace my morality. And so that's why I think she was right to use the term selfish. All right, I actually have a couple more minutes, so let's go on to one more question. Is it right, this is from Daniel, is it right to think that while someone who has everything to live for but chooses to die can't be condemned as immoral because morality presupposes the choice to live, he can be rejected and discussed as anti-life in the same way as cancer or a venomous snake? So for those who don't know, the context for this question is that Rand has a unique view of morality. And Most people, when they say there's an objective morality, they're what Ayn Rand called intrinsicists. Like there's just this morality that's good inherently, and it has nothing to do with choice. Whatever choices, like, has zero say in the good. And if morality did involve choice, then it wouldn't be objective. It would just be subjective. It'd be like, oh, morality is whatever you choose. And Ayn Rand's view is that, no, that's completely wrong. Morality is inherently rooted in our free will. It inherently involves choice, but that doesn't make it subjective. So the way she puts it in Galt's speech, and forgive me if I get it a little wrong, but it's something like, my morality, the morality of reason, is contained in a single axiom: existence exists, and in a single choice to live. The rest proceeds from these. And so the way that she's thinking about it has led to a long-standing debate among objectivists. Like, what does it mean to choose to live? And how, if at all, can we morally evaluate those who don't choose to live? I actually go into this topic in some depth in an essay I wrote on my website called Atlas Neutered, and you can find that at donswriting.com in the ideas section. I touch on a lot of other things about Ayn Rand's ethics there, and so I think it's worth reading, but let me say a couple things here. First, you can't equate not choosing to live with choosing to die. Like, very few people choose to die, and like most of the people who do choose to die, or I don't know if most, but many, they do so out of fidelity to life. Right? It's a life they can't live for some tragic reason, whether they're 80 and they lost the love of their life. They are in kind of perennial, inescapable pain. They just suffer from enormous depression and can't actually reestablish, or don't think they can reestablish, a life worth living. The issue is people who don't choose to live, which isn't the same thing. Anytime a person drifts or evades, in that moment, they're not making this positive choice to live. And when a person evades, they're actively turning against life. Implicitly, death is their standard and goal of their action, because they're literally taking goal-directed action in order to wish reality away. And so to say that morality doesn't apply to someone who chooses not to live is to say that if they're not on the premise of life in that moment, they don't need any guidance. Morality is not primarily about like us standing from the sidelines and cheering and condemning people. It's a guide for you. And if you don't want to live, if you're not actively seeking to live, you don't need a guide. You just need to sit there. And as Rand put it, I think in Philosophy Who Needs It, nature will take its course. But if you do choose to live, like if you value your life, then anyone who's evading is a threat, at least to the extent they're evading. You're condemning them from the perspective of your choice to live. Now, you wouldn't say like, oh, they're bad in the way that like cancer or snake is. No, this is something they've chosen to do with their free will. They've chosen a course of action that puts them in conflict with those seeking life, that like they're culpable for that. And so to say that the choice to live is a pre-moral choice is to say that for you, morality has no guidance to offer until and to the extent that you're choosing to live and try to govern yourself in reality. That only once you choose to focus your mind and set a purpose, then morality has a lot to say. But if you don't do that, then it has nothing to say. But it's not about our ability to judge other people. Like if they don't choose to live, if they choose to evade, they're threats. And because we do want to live, we can judge them as having chosen to make themselves threats. All right, that's my time. Do me a favor, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and definitely subscribe to my email list at donswriting.com. And if you have a question, you can email them to me at don@donswriting.com, and I will talk to you next time.